So, quickly, it's the 20th of February 2013. We're in Wynnum interviewing Peter Heathwood in preparation of the public forum and interviewing US Robert Riddel and Janina Gosseye. So, continue.
Continue. Well, we should go
I'll tell you what I
to
would
these four
like
questions, shouldn't we?
is a copy of that so I could ponder on it.
Yes, I can. We definitely send you a copy of these questions.
Yeah, so because talking with Bob is making me think and remember some of the attitudes that we had.
Well, that's the intention.
Yeah.
But, I mean, essentially there are four issues that are on the agenda here.
Well, you can tell us if you think there should be more
And,
things that we're missing.
Well,
I guess that's a worthwhile starting point, the structure
Yeah.
of those questions. And the first one is about classicism versus modernism. Now,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether those terms were ever had a currency in your student times, but in my student times, we were certainly schooled in a classical way, and modernism hardly got a mention. I mean, it was there.
No, modernism was full blast for us,
Okay.
and we were before you.
But it was in the offices, or it was taught in the school, or it was via the offices that you got
No,
in
it was
contact?
just a student thing
Mm.
because of the influence of these older ex-servicemen
Mhm.
who had done a lot of thinking about architecture,
Yes.
sitting around in camps and aerodromes and whatever, you know, with nothing to do. But they had pretty lofty ideals that they developed for the new world that was going to be a lot better than Hitler's.
So they came back from the war and they wanted to build that world.
They were setting out to build a better world, and we were influenced by that. They were
And
good
probably influenced by what they'd seen as well in terms of buildings in other places.
could have been.
Was that your experience or not?
I don't know. I'm trying to think of them and where they'd been. And Dalton was the only one that had been to Europe, except some of them flying over it, dropping bombs. He was in the British Army of Occupation. He tells everybody, and I've seen it in writing, that he was in the RAF, but he was never in the RAF. It sounded better.
So, but this whole question
But
of...
he did spend a lot of time in Germany, and he spent a lot of time drawing buildings in Germany.
And was he aware of the Bauhaus as a concept?
I think he must have been, because we certainly all were
But how?
absolutely devoted to it.
But who taught you this?
I think it was just our reading. I don't think anyone formally taught us about it at all.
So it was not in the education; it was the students themselves that sought out to read about this.
And in my case, this is age showing. Oh dear. Doesn't matter, I'll remember. But Don, he's still alive, at Fines.
Fines.
He was the leader. He was Gibson's leader. He was all of our leaders. Don, till he was crushed by Gibson.
McNiven.
It'll come to me. But anyway,
Not McNiven.
no.
And not Williamson.
They're
They're the
He's a
only
very
two I can
small
think of.
man, mousy, intellectual, big life. Had a huge library which he loaned to us all the time.
And he was teaching?
No,
He was a student.
he was teaching. He was qualified by then, and Ian Charlton, Gibson, and I were all influenced by him.
I think I know.
Don, what the hell? What's wrong with me? Anyway, He was the fellow that introduced us to the Bauhaus, and he introduced me also to town planning. He had lots of books on town planning. He wasn't a planner himself, but he made me think that our buildings were had to be. They were in another. They weren't individual things. They were in a context of society, and that was the first time I'd ever heard that thought voiced. Don Winson.
Don Winson.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, we should have known that.
Oh, what's wrong with me? Well, it's disconcerting, I can tell you, as you get a bit ancient. But no, he was a huge influence on us.
And
he had all the books on the Bauhaus. And,
because you worked in places where he worked.
yes.
And if
Yeah.
you hadn't, you wouldn't have
Well,
got it.
Probably wouldn't have. And Ian Charlton and Gibson were there too. We're all influenced by him. Gibson would deny it, of course, but I grew up with Rob, so I know him quite well, and I love him as a bloke, but we've all got our foibles.
But nobody was at CTC at the time. Nobody was actually teaching or showing you modern architecture.
I can't remember hearing anything about. I can remember Charlie Fulton talking about it, and less is more, and form follows function, blah blah blah. But I can't remember any photographs being shown, or this is,
Did they have slideshows of modern architecture?
if they did, I've forgotten.
And when you were doing designs,
It was all.
the design was in a modern language.
My word, we thought we were anyway. We were trying to.
So
well, Charlie Fulton's office was a modern building,
Oh yes.
and
They weren't all that. Colin was hopeless, and I should have lost my job over being so rude to him. But about design, because as a person he was a lovely man. And Job was so learned about building construction that it was just. I was in awe of him, what he'd say and do.
so how did he learn it?
I don't know. I don't know who taught him or where he was taught.
He was apprenticed to Brooks.
He was. That's right.
And
Because
he
he
may
had the
have
drawings of the Canberra in the office that Brooks did.
Yes. So he would have learned a bit there.
Yeah, maybe that's how he learned. I don't know Aubrey's history at all, but he certainly knew.
All I know about Aubrey really is that he was asked by his future parents-in-law would he design them a house, and that was the house on Coronation Drive, and then he did so in about 1937, and they said, well, that's your wedding present, that's your house.
Oh, it's that house. Oh, yeah, I know the house all right. Been there.
Well, it's no longer there, but
Yeah.
it was.
Yeah.
I've been there too.
That was a pretty sophisticated building for a young architect.
Well, it was heavily sort of
Derivative. but
Old English in
but
its
it
style
did-
with big gables.
it
and
fitted together nicely.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
very nicely put together.
Yep.
So, in your opinion, was there a little bit of a discrepancy between what you were taught at CTC and what you were doing as you were practicing in the firms at the same time? Do you think what you were being taught was
It
useful
wasn't
for...
when it came to criticism of your design at college, as we called it. It was criticised there was never any thought of anything other than the most recent thinking. But as a formal design course, It was never taught as such. It was osmosis,
Well, that's the way architecture was taught sort of 30 years earlier.
Well,
where you did
the apprenticeships and
Yeah.
all that sort of thing.
that you just sat in the office and learned how to do it by watching, by observation.
I was
and
nearly
osmosis.
apprenticed to Alfred Riddel once. Thank God I escaped that.
So,
Well,
I guess does that answer what you wanted to
Yes.
talk about? I mean,
yeah, I think so.
but you see, I didn't.
So
I was totally.
you've made me think about it.
Well, but you can think about it some more in preparation.
Well, that's
if
why
you
I'd like a list of that.
No, I'll give you the list, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
And, well, the next thing is these, I
We've
can't say
changed-
climatological.
We'll change it to climatic
Climatic.
concern.
Oh yes,
concerns.
but please do.
And the legacy of those, of when we started designing for climate.
No, but I think the question is rather, when did somebody point out that you were doing particular things in function of the climate here? When you were taught
I
architecture?
think that was Charlie Fulton, because he always was hammered us about it.
Well,
that came almost. I was going to use the word instinctively, but it certainly wasn't instinctive. It was just how it was done. Nobody ever suggested anything else except Jim Collin. And that's how I had this appalling row with him.
But I can remember John Dalton sort of singing the virtues of the vernacular and saying that, you know, the whole idea of the veranda was to shade the wall and so on. And
John saw these things that we who grew up with it didn't see it because it was part of us and it wasn't consciously worked out. But John did, and that was one of the nice things about working with him and doing the course with him.
But then Karl Langer came in and saw the same things and said, these are hopeless and get rid of them because they make the house too dark.
He didn't influence me much in architecture, but he influenced me about architecture in the town planning course. And I regard him as a very learned and helpful and very good teacher.
But he was interesting also in his attitude to the garden and how the garden relates to the inside or the outside of the building and water and light. He was interested in those aspects.
He was, indeed.
And he couldn't see how you could do that with the vernacular, which was only to do with taking light away and making things dark.
Well, but the very earliest buildings, like the one I'm pointing out earlier, had roof lights round where the verandas met the steep pitch. There's a gap there, and they did have windows in them.
Well, it's not very usual. Some would have.
No, but there were people who were doing it. And that was the sensible thing to do. Let light in and air out. But as you said, but the conventional ordinary builder did it without thinking anything about ventilation.
But was it in the period when this international style modernism was coming in, do you think there was more emphasis on issues of climate because these buildings were not particularly adjusted to the climate here before you had this Queensland house, timber and tin house, and then the international style came in, which was brick and which was solid? And do you think there was more emphasis on issues of climate because these buildings were not adjusted, and when that style was imported here, you had to find a way to adjust it to the climate? I think that's...
I'd have to think about that because the idea of thinking about classicism against modernism is something almost foreign to me. I just have never considered classicism as helpful, except even their proportions weren't good. You know,
Well, you might have had to think about it if you were doing a public building.
Well, I
that-
never did, but thinking about rhythms of columns, Carly pointed out to me, and how important it is to the syncopation of the rhythm of columns as you drove along or you walked along a veranda. But I wouldn't have thought of that as classicism. I would have thought of that as a natural human reaction to something.
Well, you get people like Neville Lund, when he's
Yes.
writing about Robin Dodds, he's
Yes.
saying, look, here is an architect who's conscious of climate design and is taking those lessons from the vernacular and putting them together in a more sophisticated way that has these influences.
I've read Nev's thesis.
Did that,
A long time
was
ago.
he the only one saying those things, or was everyone saying that? Or was anyone even aware of it?
Oh, no, everyone. It was common Australian usage, with us anyway, Queensland usage. That wasn't any great new novelty. It was part of what we'd grown up with.
But the reality is that Robin Dodds didn't always build timber houses. He
No.
built brick houses with the best of them, and
Yep.
they were.
And I don't think even today that people realise just how good he was.
Well, why was he good?
What's that?
Why was he good?
Well, he could handle space very well. Have you ever looked at Tamrukan Church
Yes.
and the entrance way from the street? How it's, if this is the fence of the side street, it's indented like that and it's pointing to the entrance. And the thing's revealed to you as you come along. And it's a masterly exercise using common fencing and a few trees that are very, very capable.
Well, I agree,
Yeah.
but it's
And Nindawimba. Some of the things that happened at Nindawimba, I've learned later, were more or less accidental. And it was a bit gloomy inside. The most used room was the sunroom thing on the front.
what became the ballroom, but it was the room you entered into.
Yeah. But I think he improved as he went along. He began to get light into the middle of the building and sort of thing.
Well, I mean,
And his church up on Red Hill has it's decades since I was in it, and I remember it as being floodlit, well lighted.
he always talked about it as possessing a dim religious light.
Yes.
So he
well,
didn't want it to be.
When I started to design religious buildings, that's how I thought they ought to be. I've changed my mind, but
Well, it depends if you need to read in them or not,
yeah,
because they were. If you go into a 16th century church in Europe, there's not a lot of light coming in.
no, there's not, and there's a lot of dark.
There's a few
timber
candles, and
yeah,
it
and
has that.
It's all a mystery.
And that has that
I
quality.
don't think today that mystery's got much to do with it. But anyway, that I'm not religious in any event, even though I've been designing churches. But Roger's the one that knows about those things.
Well, so I guess we get back to climate and how much of our knowledge of climate and how to respond to it affected architecture, and was this taught to us?
Looking back, I know that climate was the dominant thing in my thinking when I was designing, and ventilation, good light, protection from the sun and the whatnot. And only secondarily did I start thinking later about the space itself and how comfortable you'd be in the space visually. And that came quite a bit after I started to think about the deeper meanings of being in a building.
Yeah, well, one of the obvious things that is, as soon as you start looking at, say, houses by Hayes and Scott that had pretty much flat roofs on them, and you compared that to, say, Robin Dodd's with the huge roof volume that was ventilated, and you said, well, okay, that huge volume is the insulator. How do you do it on a flat roof?
Well, on that ridge we always had a long vent, but that's another story.
Oh, well, it was a vent.
Which Hayes and Scott didn't do.
Well,
and what started me on doing that was I had to go with Bernie Wallace one day to lift a section of a corrugated asbestos cement roof, lift the ridge.
Mm.
And when we lifted the ridge, must have been a hot day, the heat physically blew us backward. It was just like opening a furnace. And
hot air rises to the top.
I began to think, I've read about this and I know about it, but I didn't realise the force. It was just, it physically pushed you back.
But then, you know, quite some years before, well, Robin Dodd's, for instance, always had ventilated ridges.
Yeah.
And that allowed the hot air out the top, and there was a vent to allow it in at the bottom, and that's how it worked.
But he also had flat ceilings inside, which made it pretty difficult for the air to move.
Well, the air was moving because it was ventilated from the eaves and it went out the top, but it didn't ventilate the room. The room was ventilated by having big doors that opened and very easy planning that allowed the wind to go right through it.
He didn't come to the point of the air in the room being moved by the heat.
Yeah. Well, that was certainly the case in the 1880s when you had those fretwork grills in the ceiling that actually took the air out of the room.
It's interesting how things are lost, will become unfashionable or something.
Yeah, well. Anyway, that's...
Well, think of where we are with the standard box that's being built all over Brisbane.
Yes.
Absolutely no thought.
Yes.
No thought.
Well,
and then you get these pictures of the builders selling their houses in the Courier Mail and whatever. And I always look at them and say, well, if that was north, you know, and no matter what you do with it, it's not going to work. It's just not thought about.
Yep. And in some ways it's the banks that insist on that when you get a loan, that you have a certain sort of construction. They used to be very pedantic about what construction you had.
And the banks are wary of lending money to an individual to build a house. They much prefer to see a house that's there. And they can, you know, the bank managers don't understand, but they can see a building that's there and they've got a security. And war service homes have ceased with all those people who were concerned about the buildings they were going to live in. The Housing Commission went somewhere along the track.
Well, they all had standards of construction, though, didn't they? You weren't inventing it.
Oh, no, but there were people like Frank Thompson thinking about ventilation and whatnot, not very effectively, I thought, but although Frank's a very dear friend of mine, but...
well, Steve Zoccolai made a bit of a study of it.
He did.
And I don't know, did you have him as a lecturer?
No, and when we bought his book, we all thought he was just going over old ground.
So you knew all that stuff anyway?
Well, we thought we did.
So someone taught you,
Yeah.
or you picked it up.
I don't know. A lot of it might have been just arguing among ourselves.
But it was a topic of discussion.
Oh yes, yes.
And, I mean, regionalism came into it a bit
Yes,
or not?
a bit. Yes.
So
it
we were
did.
different to Sydney?
And I remember going with this same Bernie Wallace, the builder, to sail at Lake Catharaba and discovering these houses that were red stained timber and white all over just north of Brisbane. And that was quite a tradition. Some of them couldn't afford to put the red all the way, so it only went on the front and part of the sides. But it was a timber preserving.
Well, it was linseed oil based.
I don't know what it was really. But
Yeah, it was linseed oil with a pigment in it, a paint pigment,
yeah.
and it was usually red oxide.
And it was a standard housing commission thing. You could get your house done with that.
Well, that's what Robin Dodds did all his houses
Yeah,
of that
yeah.
way, and he was probably one of the first to be treating them that way. And that colour scheme is very much like you find in Sweden or
Oh yes, very much.
and also Middle America.
Yes,
So
well, I've
it
never
was-
been to Middle America, and I haven't seen much architecture from there, but certainly Sweden and Denmark.
So where there's a tradition of timber buildings, linseed oil that was stained was a good way of...
The problem was linseed oil will grow mould after a while, and you've got to keep fresh applications on it.
But it soaks into the timber and sort of
Yeah,
the timber absorbs it and you have to keep doing it. But at least it's not like painting. You don't have to strip it off. You just put more over the top.
just keep putting it on.
Mm.
And eventually it goes sort of blackish, but it does preserve the timber. My first house I did that, and eventually had to paint it. You raised another thing, Rob, that I was going to say, yes, I remember that. Now I can't remember anything. But anyway.
It'll come. The third one is about whether architecture was seen as a cultural aspiration or a trade. And I know a lot of the people who studied with me just wanted a job in the government, and they didn't care about architecture per se as an art.
And some were a bit sad, weren't they?
Yes, but I mean, they're also necessary. I mean, you need good technicians as long as they knew what they were doing. They knew construction, then there was always going to be a place for them. But the thing is that construction developed at such a rate. I mean, there was a tradition of building in timber, as we've talked about for houses, but when it comes to larger buildings and we start getting into, poured concrete buildings and steel framed buildings and all of that sort of construction, you had to learn anew.
Yeah, and a lot of architects, like Dalton's a typical example, just wouldn't move out of the timber construction at all.
But when he came to do a university building or something, how did he treat that?
He didn't like doing it.
I'm thinking Griffith, where he did a reasonable...
He didn't like, he felt quite out of his depth doing that.
So he relied on people he employed?
Well, probably Charles Ham. I don't really know what went on in his office, because we were well apart by that time.
I suppose Charles Ham's somebody we could talk to, really.
I haven't heard his name yet.
Yeah, I had, but I
Nice
forgot.
man.
But
yeah.
your student contemporaries, do you think it was a cross section of
Student
what you'd
of
see
Dalton's.
in
He
society?
worked for Dalton for a long time. I'm not sure that he wasn't an associate or something. But
When you were studying people in your year, do you think there was a diversity of people there?
oh yes,
and with different backgrounds and different regions where they'd come from?
Well, you talked about Wilf Jews.
Yeah, well,
And
Wolf Jews was a Brisbane man, but he a lot of his thinking was well developed before he decided to do architecture.
Mm.
His attitudes were developed.
And
He was a quite devout man in a lot of ways, which we weren't.
but he wasn't a designer. He was the top spec writer.
Absolutely unable to visualise anything.
Mm.
You'd just say, lovely man, but should never have been an architect. And yet, as Rob's pointed out, he became the best writer in the business, and he wrote the book,
And he taught it at QIT.
which I still use as a reference, because of all the headings in case you forget something.
Mm.
But and of course Dalton was different because he came from UK when he was a mature man, and he was a 10-pound bomb, and David Longland, you might remember, was the director of migration or something in Queensland.
But he was in the public works department.
Yes.
Was he not?
And David Longland suggested to him that he think about architecture.
Mm.
That's well, I think he would have come to it anyway because of his nature, but Longland encouraged him, as he did other migrants. He tried to help people settle and get on with their lives. But Dalton was a well, it's irrelevant really. I was going to say he had a absolutely blazing temper that really appeared, but when it did, his sister even told me that he would end up with a hangman's noose around his neck because he had these extremely violent outbursts.
And when the course at UQ started, did you think there was a difference between the two courses at QIT or CTC at UQ? Was CTC regarded as more technical, whereas UQ was regarded as a more artistic type of education? Or
I don't think so.
I mean,
you see, we had a fairly unique period. Yes, please.
White,
Yeah.
no sugar.
Yes, contemporaneously with us, we had something like 12, 13 students at, I don't think it was QIT then.
CTC.
I think it was. And the matching course at U of Q only had 3 students. And in the year following, there's only 1 student, John Yasinski. So all these people, lecturers, would lose their jobs. So they made us go over to
UQ.
To St Lucia at night, which was a confounded nuisance because we all worked in the city. And then we had to come home, a long way. And we stopped having Charlie Fulton and co and had Cummings and Lucas. Bruce Lucas. And Lucas was all right, but I could never get on with Cummings. In fact, none of us could. I didn't think he was a capable man at all.
And did you get along with the 3 students at UQ? Was there
Oh yes. It made no difference at all. Yes, no. We'd all, in effect, done the same course. Just that we'd done it at night and they'd done it in the day. And
but they were not more advanced in particular areas with regards.
Oh, we were miles more advanced in design, miles more, different altogether.
Well, because you've had to do it.
But we've been doing it for some time, 3 years, and.
But also your employers would allow you to do it, or
Well,
expect you.
We had to earn our living. It was no good not being able to do it, or you would lose your job. But I think also Anne Greenfield was doing it as a sort of hobby, and Margaret Thingo was looking for a husband.
She found one.
I'm sure she did. I've seen her once with her. And Peter was coming into a practice. And I don't think he was a natural born architect either. But he was clever enough to handle what he was obliged to do. And then the following year, John Jasinski was pretty clever. But he'd been an engineer before he started architecture. And so a lot of it was known to him, you know. But he didn't know much about building construction, because they don't get taught much about, or didn't in my day. They got about 6 months building construction in their course. That's all. So the tendency to leave structure to engineers these days is reliant on a weak read unless you know the bloke's very experienced. You just can't go to any structural mechanic or any engineer and say, you know, check over the structure of this building, because some of them don't know much at all, because it's not a big part of their course, or using to be. You know, I could be out of date about that.
Well,
socially progressive or politically engaged. How do you think the architecture students were very concerned with politics and such at that time when you were studying?
Oh,
are you wanting to change the world? Yes.
yeah, we were, and we were influenced by the ex-servicemen again, because they were tending to be left-wing in a mild sort of way.
And did they believe that architecture could do this, could change the world?
I don't know whether we ever just got that deep.
Well, of course.
They certainly felt it was natural and necessary to reform architecture and stop wasting money and doing silly things and so on. And it had to be a very considered thing, not a relying on intuition or like Mr. Gargett said once, that boy's got a good idea of design, you know. Whatever that meant.
This is Bren Gargett.
Bren, yeah. For whom I have had the highest regard, because I was chairman of a committee that he was on at the the practicing architects group for quite some years, and he was, when there was a problem, he could solve it. He was very, very good, but he wasn't an architect.
But he had been. I mean,
oh, he had been. I've got drawings here of the Dunlop house that he did, and they're a bit like an early sketch. That the builder knew what to do.
Yes. Yeah. And I suppose Arnold Conrad, of the two of them, probably had more skills in that.
More understanding, yes. Well, he'd done a lot of buildings, of course, before Bren came, official part of the practice.
But Bren came in as a prize-winning student, and so he did have skills.
Yeah, I always felt that he was just in the wrong vocation. But I liked him as a fellow.
Well, he was very good with people.
Yeah.
And he was a very good head to that firm. He built it up to the biggest firm in the
Oh,
place.
yes. He once accused me of not wasting my youth playing billiards. But I always remember that. We didn't really have any idea what we were doing playing at their place, you know.
Well, the advice that he gave me was, we don't do flat roofs, they leak.
Oh, well. The older I've got, the more I've come to that view too. Because the one I've got leaks like buggery.
So, when you were reading about all the modern architecture that was being built in Europe and all these Siedlungen, I don't know what the English word for it is. In Germany, they build all these Siedlungen, like housing estates with small houses, all identical.
Oh,
This
yeah.
is public housing.
Public housing, yes. Was that also being described in the journals that you read, the social
No.
program that was behind it?
No, that never got into the journals.
No? Oh, is it that
No,
why is it
only
no-
the,
why is it
only
no
the
Siedlung?
good work got into the journals.
But that was good work. Those were
Yeah.
prominent architects doing that. Bloch, I think? No, who is it that did the
Oh,
Weisenhof
yeah.
Siedlung?
Um,
Anyway, it will come to me.
I can only remember Alto doing work in Germany, which wasn't the same as in his own country or in Scandinavia.
Yeah, I can't
Not that it was anything wrong with it, but
Thank you, Mother.
gee whiz.
Well, Jane's not well, so I think I make coffee as well as she does.
Weisenhof Siedlung. Do you know that?
No, I don't.
It's famous, you know it.
I've the gap in my education.
No, you know it, I'm sure.
I'm sure that couldn't be true,
Oh,
that you would have a gap.
Would you like a glass of water or anything else?
Maybe
Where did you-
Yes, if
How did you become so conscientious?
yeah, I'm not conscientious.
You are.
I'm out
You
for a
are.
good time.
Your work is very clearly and well thought out. You know what you're doing.
Well,
Where did that come from? Is that nature or your education? Excuse
I
me.
think if I think back to my time as a student, one of the biggest influences was seeing the television program that Robin Boyd made about
Oh yes,
design,
yes.
and I used to absolutely soak that up.
Yes, we did too.
And you know, here was somebody talking in an articulate way with
And he
the
was
images.
Australian.
And he was Australian. He
here,
was one of
yeah.
us.
He was a guru and he was one of us, yes.
And
That was true.
so there was that, and then my father used to get a lot of journals from Italy in Italian that I couldn't read, but there was a lot of architecture and design in there, and I used to see this stuff and I'm thinking,
Oh, yeah,
Why isn't it like that here?
Yeah.
why isn't it like that here? Why do we never see this stuff?
Yeah.
And you didn't know who was doing it or really where it was coming from, except that it was coming from Italy and you couldn't read about it because it was in Italian.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. We've got a Milanese working here now. Very nice man.
Do you think we should be talking about other things during this forum, or are there things that you think might be important to discuss when we look at architectural education?
I've never been a philosopher. I've only thought about the work I'm doing then, now. So I haven't, I've got views, but I haven't reached a point where I've discussed them with people, except at a student level in the old days.
I think, though, there's a lot to be said for doing articles in the way that it used to be done, whereby you just sat in an office and saw architecture happening in front of you. I mean, you saw people make decisions about, well, what's this building going to look like? I mean, but you have to get the planning sorted out and make that decision about what it's looking like all at once.
It takes a while to do those two mental processes together.
Yeah. And some people are very good at it, and you see how they do it, and you learn.
I didn't initially. I did the planning and then I did the thinking, and but that's not how I operate now.
But there's also this other thing about, well, what's the appropriate form for this building to have, given that it's got to sit in a particular place next to other things, which wasn't much of a concern in my day, I must say.
Well, Jim Riddel set me off on that track because he's a master at putting a building on a site.
But a site where he might prefer a site that was greenfield, so he could site it with natural things rather than site it with other people's buildings, which he probably didn't like.
Well, yeah, I don't think he worried him with the view of Kew. It didn't worry him. He certainly was a bit eccentric at times. But
Well, I'm not sure what you'd say his response to Hennessy's design for the Great Court was when he came to build a few bits of it. He kept the footprint of it, and then he kept the stone, but then he probably had to.
Yeah.
But some of those
a
buildings,
difficult job, wouldn't it?
they're not his best buildings, I
No.
think. Where his best buildings
Very
were
different.
where he was out, like Union College
yeah.
or the agriculture building, where he had a greenfield site, and he could plan it in a fairly eccentric way.
He sent me a lot of work over the years. In fact, I've received more work from architects than anybody else.
Well, me too.
Well, that's the way of
It's
it.
a nice way
especially
to be,
guys
isn't
in
it?
the government and so.
Mm.
But that is gone now because the people who make decisions about that sort of thing are more often likely to be clerks than architects.
Yeah, and it has to be seen to be competitive. So,
Everything.
Oh,
Everything.
whereas
Money is a very easy thing to judge, even if you're a clerk.
in
you
my
can tell
days,
whether 2 is less than 3,
Yeah,
and that's
true.
all they're asked to do.
but in the days
Thank you very much.
where I was at Conrad and Gargett, there was no thought that the next hospital they wouldn't be doing. I mean, it was just you did the last hospital, you do the next one. Same with the fire stations, same with all the banks. Those clients were yours for life. You didn't have to go in and bid fees and.
I can remember
Conrad
them
and
being
Gargett
a
were-
bit narky when we got ANZ and NAB banks, and we started to do hospital work. And there was a little undercurrent, And then when we did the master plan at Anglican Church Grammar School, that was really setting up.
Yep, you were treading on somebody's turf,
Mm.
as they saw it.
I hadn't even been an old boy.
But Conrad and Gargett were written into the Health Act, weren't they, as architects at one time?
I wouldn't be surprised.
But they certainly, I mean, their hospitals served extremely well. I mean,
Oh, the best hospital I know
Redcliffe.
since demolished. Well, Redcliffe is one, and
Joe Orange knew what he was
and
doing.
the Prince Charles Hospital, the original part that was the sanatorium for TB. Magnificent building, since pulled down, of course. But Redcliffe Hospital's a very, very good hospital. And I think it's
There was a
just
lot of skills.
extremely wasteful the way we're pulling down buildings designed to last 100-year storm, which they must be by law, which could easily be refitted with the latest thinking. And Southern architects recommend they be pulled down. And that's just madness.
I think part of that thinking is that hospitals get infected with the kind of bugs that they're just in the fabric.
Well,
Well, Prince Charles, there was an old sister, well, she wasn't old actually, she was quite young, but she told us that the thing that Golden Staff was, she would keep it under control without problem simply by admitting sunlight, keeping things clean. She said air conditioning is the worst thing you can do for
well,
Golden
air
Staff.
conditioning should not be allowed in hospitals, as it currently is, because